Yeah, to let you know that there's a recording in progress. And also to introduce you to Dr. Jason Windawi, who holds a PhD from Princeton University, where his dissertation focused on the social organization of blockchain technology as an emergent form of digital transformation. And he did spend some time with us up here at UBC, working specifically with Dr. Mark David Seidel, and also participating in co-teaching and co-leading our recent offering of the micro-certificate in blockchain leadership, innovation and implementation. So in addition, his ongoing research on blockchain and digital transformation. In addition to that, Jason is a research fellow at the Jane Family Institute, where he's developing a computational policy research tool with that organization. Jason's career includes several prior roles in investment management as an analyst and as an entrepreneur. He also holds degrees from Columbia University and Stanford University. So Jason, thank you for joining us today. And now over to you.
Great. Well, I have to start by thanking you, Vicki, and Chang, and Mark David, and everyone at Blockchain at UBC for the opportunity to present this work. It has been a long time in coming, this particular project, and so I'm really excited to be able to present it here and get some feedback and hopefully have a nice generative discussion. I also want to start by acknowledging, I know we're all dialing in from different places, so I will speak for myself and say that I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Lenape people. All right, so let's get started. So you'll notice this talk is about, of course, blockchain governance, but you'll see a lot of terms like digital and institutional that are often not included in titles of work like that. So I want to start by talking about where this paper comes from. So to take a step back, and I think a lot of us are familiar with this history, blockchain itself comes out of the cypherpunk tradition, or at least the core technologies do. And that tradition itself involves several attempts to explicitly create digital alternatives to traditional institutions like accounting, law, property, and so on. And so the link between blockchain and governance is even stronger than we might think. It's inherent and built into the foundations. And because of that, there is a small but very rapidly growing set of work on blockchain governance, to which I seek to contribute in part with this paper. I would also note that work on blockchain governance, because of the complexity and novelty of the technology, often in order to serve an agenda-setting role, that research tends to focus on that complexity and novelty. And so that leaves a theoretical gap, which is what I intend to step into with this paper, between studies of blockchain and broader studies of digital governance more broadly. So that is what I do. I flip this on its head, and in my paper, I begin with established findings on digital governance, and particularly around paradoxes and affordances. And I use that to frame both the question I ask, which is how do the affordances of blockchain as a digital technology enable its stakeholders to navigate the tensions those affordances create? And I also use this to flow through the rest of the paper. So how is the talk and the paper organized? So I begin with these findings I mentioned earlier about digital governance, and particularly around digital governance tensions and affordances. I then lay out the empirical terrain. I go on from there to build an Ostrom adjusted, I'm calling it an Ostrom plus digital framework, because I argue we need to look beyond Ostrom. She's a great starting point, but not an ending point. I then apply the framework, I discuss the findings, and we talk about the conclusion. So to begin with, where does this framework come from? And what I really do here is I'm attempting to synthesize and build on literature, very broadly speaking, around digital transformation. And here, in terms of this top level, what I'm working with is primarily the literature on digital platforms, digital governance, and digital transformation in that context. And so a lot of this work, to just summarize very briefly, begins with the characteristics of digital technology. What is unique and interesting about digital technology? Well, as Jonathan Zittrain showed us, it's generative, right? So it's each innovation then also becomes potentially the basis of another innovation. It's characterized by openness to participation and to change and to copying. And finally, fluidity. It is itself constantly changing, in part because of these two other characteristics. And so what does this lead to? Well, in particular, the literature on in digital infrastructure and platform governance focuses, and I'm thinking of the work here of Tilson and Tawana and their colleagues, focuses on tensions and paradoxes. So they talk about the paradox of control, which is how do you maintain generativity without so much openness that something becomes chaos. And the other is the paradox of change, which is how do you maintain the benefits of generativity and fluidity without, again, something devolving into a free-for-all. And so some of this literature also extends on this to identify governance, particularly as the means of navigating the change and navigating these paradoxes. So when I talk about governance tensions, this is what I'm talking about, the idea of digital governance as a means of navigating these tensions. The second stream of research I pull from is really grounded in, well, certainly Wanda Orlikowski, and I know she wasn't the first, but perhaps the most influential, to argue that when we talk about information in organizations, often we bracket and take for granted the technology and focus on organization instead. And so there's been a very strong call coming from that literature at the intersection of technology and organizations to bring the technology back in a way that navigates this theoretical impasse between fully social constructionist, and determinism, which we don't need to get into. But authors like Kalinikos and Paul Leonardi and their colleagues make a very compelling case that we can think about affordances of technology as something that it's neither innate nor fully constructed, but rather it's relationally defined. So Samir Faraj and a co-author describe it as action possibilities that come out of this intersection of a specific technology and a specific set of actors. So I extend that to describe a subset of affordances where I'm interested in governance affordances. So what are the governance action possibilities for specific actors created by a digital technology? So this framework of tensions and affordances is what I use through much of what follows. So the natural next question is, all right, we're talking about blockchain. I think it will be a surprise to none of us who know the technology at least reasonably well that word is used very broadly to mean lots of different things. There was a nice blog post by a practitioner named Nick Carter /VC who described blockchain in general as a semantic wasteland for this reason. So I'm going to define it a little more specifically. So when I think of blockchain, I think of a cluster of technologies. So it starts with a peer-to-peer network or networks. Often these networks are themselves layered, in which the nodes are defined as code plus the hardware it runs on. Then there's blockchain ledgers themselves, a tamper-resistant ledger distributed across the network. But then there's often an additional layer that becomes very important, and that is built out of smart contracts that extend the ledger's reach into becoming a platform. And then finally, one or more cryptographic tokens. So that's an awful lot to think through, right? And so that's obviously too much. So the challenge empirically is to find a place to focus within all of that. So I note that all of these functions, both within these layers and in the interactions between them, are governed by blockchain protocols. So what do I mean by that? I mean the core technological logic, incentive system, and code that jointly define the functioning of an implemented blockchain project. And that word implemented becomes important because governance only kicks in once something is created. So that is sort of an empirical case. I can also talk about the theoretical case, but in the interest of time, I'll bracket that. For why we would focus on protocols. So what do I mean by protocols? Well, I focus on protocols in part because they're very interesting. And so I describe protocols using the term primitives, which a lot of practitioners use to describe something that's familiar to anyone who's ever worked with or looked at modularity. So the idea is you have categories of things, and then you have sort of implemented, vetted, and tested components within those. So those include base protocols, which we could think of these as anything from proof of work, proof of stake, to Bitcoin's longest chain rule. I realize I'm throwing a lot of technical language around. The point is that there are vetted components that are base protocols that get recombined. The next step are cryptographic primitives. These are usually hashing functions. They're ways of establishing randomness and security. There are cryptoeconomic primitives that have to do with monetary policy, issuance of money, how incentives are set. And then these are all codified into open source code libraries. And so on the right, it's a very busy visual, I realize. The point I mean to make with this visual is what I've done is I've started with Bitcoin's core repository and traced the ways in which that repository has been recombined with other base protocols and cryptographic primitives to create a series of other protocols that perhaps you've heard of. And the idea here is that you've got all the characteristics of digital technology in terms of openness, in terms of generativity, and in terms of fluidity. So I would argue that these are an especially interesting place to study this sort of intersection of blockchain and the digital. So the final question in terms of how to study this is, what's the framework and approach? And so I mentioned Ostrom earlier, and I want to be clear about the value of Ostrom, who I think is an incredible, I mean, obviously we all think she's incredible, but I'm not the first to apply Ostrom to either digital technology or blockchain, but I would note that most people who work from Ostrom start with her 1990 book, the one for which she won the Nobel Prize and the one for which she's best known, which is her work around commons and common pool resources, which is a very specific kind of institution. But Ostrom's entire later career, and this is most clearly crystallized in her 2005 book, was about how to generalize analytical tools and variables for the analysis of specific institutions that takes into account their heterogeneity. So it's not just common pool. She really attempted to broaden her framework to make it applicable to all kinds of institutions. And in particular, she specified a set of variables that are specific to a resource and then nested vertical levels of governance. And those who are familiar with Ostrom will recognize this as polycentricity. I would just note that in her later work, she was very clear about the fact that polycentricity was nested in levels rather than broader as earlier work argued. So with that said, again, she was trying to trying to create a framework for the analysis of institutions more broadly. And so that's what I begin to build from. But I also extend it in a couple of ways. So first of all, I refine it for digital governance using the framework that I just mentioned. And then also I populate it using digital ethnography. So methods like the ones I use to construct that Bitcoin recombination slide. So spending a lot of time on GitHub, tracing decision-making, tracing community interaction, and we can come back and talk about that later. So with that said, what is the framework? So as I said, I start with Ostrom. So the variables across the top will be familiar to anybody who's spent time with their work. Within a community, what are the roles and rights? What are the incentives and rewards? She would call it sanctions and rewards. What are the rules in use? And what is, how does a community create consensus? But then I also go with her polycentric levels, and these are levels that come from her work. So she specifies usually that 3 levels are enough for an analysis. So she names, and these levels, by the way, they're vertically laid out so that the deepest are the ones that are most entrenched and most resistant to change. So we start with normal operations. We then switch to collective choice situations where changes to the operational mode are debated. And then we go deeper than that down to the constitutional level where changes to collective choice rules are discussed. So I extend this with 2 of the literature derived variables I mentioned earlier in terms of the nature of change at each level, and then what are the governance affordances at each level. And so this is the framework that I seek to fill in. So what I'm going to do next is just briefly walk through each of the 3 levels and then conclude by talking about what I determined from that. So beginning with the operational level, this is normal operations, and this is something that most of us start with when we start studying Bitcoin, or when we start studying blockchain, which is Bitcoin. So Bitcoin's protocol in terms of how the nodes come to agreement, how money is issued, who are the participants, that's an example of how this functions. 0x, a distributed exchange, is comprised instead of a protocol, well, it is a protocol, but it is built out of smart contracts, which is a very specific kind of rules and encoded mechanisms. And so a couple of things that I want to draw out here. First of all, this is largely an algorithmic sense, right? Because we're talking about what happens within the context of the protocol. The other thing I'd point out is that the roles and rights that are attached here are largely those of provisioners and users of network resources. So whether that is the computation that provides the basis for Bitcoin, or the liquidity that comprises the network of a decentralized exchange, it is provisioners and users of network resources who are generally determined by the protocol. and what incentives, rewards they have, and so on. I would also note that those are subject to a cost of entry typically. It's not, while theoretically anybody could participate and serve in one of these roles, it requires a significant investment typically to do it. But this is a pretty straightforward level. The next level down are changes to the operational level. So this is the collective choice in Elinor Ostrom's framework. And the nature of changes here, given her definition that I'm working with, would be changes in those 4 primitives that I talked about for a specific protocol. So examples at this level would include Zcash is a relatively famous privacy-oriented cryptocurrency. And so they recently changed their monetary policy. The Bitcoin community had a hugely contentious debate about block size. And there's a great book about that called The Block Size Wars, if you want to read it. But these are examples where a community changes part of a protocol. And so moves forward in that way. And so what I would point out is whereas the last level was much more algorithmic, this level starts from outside of the protocol. So there's what's in the protocol and there's what's outside the protocol in terms of making decisions about it. And so this level has evolved from what scholars of open source call participation architectures. So these are sets of rules and sets of processes for proposing and deliberating and enacting changes that are highly structured. And so the roles in these processes include the provisioners and network users that we talked about earlier, but it's also broadens to include developers, obviously, and funders of development. One other thing I would note here is that there is, what I've presented so far is a very sort of sunny example of everything working and nothing needed to change. But community consensus becomes extremely important at this level because the consensus, the success of these kinds of changes are conditioned on the legitimacy of the participation architecture and the perceived legitimacy of the outcomes. And when those things don't work, when there isn't some sort of community consensus, there can be a fork and something very specific can happen. And so in the open source literature in technology, and perhaps I'm wrong, but my understanding of it from what I've looked at, forks are treated as sort of an exceptional event because they're focused on a single community. But in fact, the use of open source so broadly embeds what political scientist / social theorist Unger calls destabilization rights. So he was writing in the context of experimental governance and true democracy in the sense that people can unwind and start from zero within a polity, which is obviously very theoretical, but that's also something that characterizes open source innately. So there's this ability to fork, to split not only the technology and copy something and create something new, but also to split a community to create a completely new community. So it's a place where the technology and the social are really specifically interrelated. And that actually brings us to the third level, which I would argue is potentially the squishiest, but also actually by far the most interesting. Because here, theoretically, there are changes to collective choice. What does that mean? Well, in this framework, it means changes to the Ostrom variables, which sounds pretty anodyne, but in reality, we have some really dramatic examples of cases where, again, the social and the technology, social defined as the governance and the technology itself completely transform. So one example would be to fork to create a new project, which Zcash and Ethereum both did, where there are now derivatives of those with the same history up to a certain point, and then a completely new community, completely new technology. There are also changes in consensus protocols. I think the literature on blockchain, we all tend to treat consensus protocols as just, this is the consensus protocol for that chain, and yet that's often not the case. And the highest profile example of that right now is the transition in Ethereum from proof of work to proof of stake, where you've got not only a change in the rules, but you've got a wholesale change in the nature of who is interacting with the ledger. Another example is moving to a new blockchain. So rather than a blockchain itself creating a new consensus protocol, the whole application layer on top of it can switch to a new one. And so Gnosis, which has historically been one of the highest profile Ethereum projects, recently sort of merged with the XDAI chain, which is a fascinating process in itself, which we can come back to. And the last is something that's happening much more broadly, which is a transition to DAO governance. So DAOs have been in the news a lot because a lot of them are being created, but it is equally the case that there are a lot of projects that have been around for a while, like Augur, which was one of the first prediction markets, that have over time progressively decentralized through a series of stages that have finally resulted in the governance of the protocol itself transitioning to a DAO. And so again, you can imagine this as a recreation of all of these Ostrom, or maybe not all of them, but multiple Ostrom variables below, where you have new rules in use being created, new roles and rights that are really broadening of roles and participation, which DAOs allow. And so to go back, for those who aren't familiar with DAOs, the most succinct explanation I can think of is a DAO is a concatenation of smart contracts that takes over a lot of the logic of organization, and so that it becomes much easier to specify and automate who gets to participate and how. And so it's a modular structure that is often created in its own right, but then, as I said, it's often substituted into existing projects more and more. To go back to the Ostrom variables, their incentives and rewards. I think here of Christine Dessan's amazing work on the constitutional nature of money and the ability of creating purpose-built money to align with a lot of the broadening of roles and participation that I discussed above is unique to this layer, I would argue. And finally, community consensus, new mechanisms for arriving at consensus through voting, through prediction markets, et cetera. And so a natural question is, we've got all these variables, we've got all these examples, how do they mesh? And I would argue it happens through a couple of stages. So the first is we have rapid experimentation and public development at the field and the project level in all of the variables I describe here. So each of these modes that I'm talking about, and it's very general language because it's happening in sort of multiple dimensions, this is ongoing and rapid development. And then that development creates a set of tools that can be recombined into existing projects or to create new projects. And that kind of recombination is how we get to the examples I talked about. So given all of that, where does that bring us back, in terms of the framework? What do I find? So going back to the framework here, we've talked a lot about the Ostrom variables that were blue. So I've abstracted those out. We can go back if we need to. But I focus here on the nature of change and the governance affordances at each of these levels. So operational, which I've named governance by protocols, because this is, behavior encompassed by the protocol. The nature of change is, less relevant here. And the governance affordances are largely algorithmic. So they have to do with control and stability. And this control and stability is often what enables the higher layers of the platform to operate. The next level down, which I'm calling governance of protocols, and of and by is standard language in science and technology studies when talking about algorithms. But the governance of protocols, the nature of change here is changes to protocol components, as I mentioned earlier, but the governance affordances here are open source. So you have this combination, this interesting combination of structured change through participation architectures, but also these destabilization rights. So these rights are an affordance at this level, but they only become relevant in terms of their effects at the next level down, which is constitutional. In Ostrom's terms, I describe this as governance transformations via protocols, because again, we have these here as significant transformations of existing projects, but they happen through a protocol. And so I call this governance transformations via protocols. In Ostrom terms, these are defined as changes to Ostrom variables, or we can think about these as changes to the combination of technology and social organization in each of those variables. And the affordances here, I think, are different. So I think they encompass both what we have in terms of open source, as well as what we have in terms of algorithmic control. And you combine those with a community-wide or field-wide commitment to progressive decentralization and experimentation, and you end up with something new, I argue, which I call institutional generativity. So this is the ability, again, to recombine aspects that are coming from outside and from inside the protocol to create something new in terms of ways of organizing, incentivizing, and defining social interaction. So what does institutional generativity get us? Well, I want to come back to this, the second piece here, which is thinking about what I mentioned earlier in terms of governance as navigating paradoxes of change and control, right? And so if we work within the Ostrom framework, there's a neat sort of just so story, and it's there by construction, right? Because it's how her levels are constructed, where you have hierarchies of control and of change. And so by hierarchy, I mean, starting with control, the bottom level controls the next two levels up, the second level controls the first, and so on. And then you also have a hierarchy of change that moves in the opposite way, where something changing or needing to change at the operational level triggers collective choice, and something not working or needing to change there triggers the constitutional level. Okay, I mean, again, there's a nice story there and it maps, but it is an artifact of the construction of Ostrom, right? So what is specific to blockchain protocols? So I would say control works in roughly the same way, in that the bottom layer controls the middle layer, controls the layer above that, but change is different. So change, instead of going down only, it encompasses that, but it also goes in the reverse direction. So we can see that there's, rather than a hierarchy of change, we have something much more fluid and potentially much more disruptive and generative at the same time. And finally, I would argue one other observation, which is perhaps there's a paradox specific to blockchain. So I'm hardly the first to notice that there's often a difference between distributed technology and the social organization or power. What I would argue here is that the Ostrom plus digital framework lets us think about that a little more specifically. So we have the potential paradox here is defined by the fact that we have distributed and open technology that relies on participation by multiple actors. But at the same time, as we saw it in each of the levels, participation in terms of the roles and rights attached to them is often conditioned on scarce financial, human, technical capital. And by human capital here, I mean expertise and scarce programming talent. And so absent intervention, it would seem that distributed participation will be contradicted by scarcity of capital. And so to the extent that those things can be brought more closely in line, where decentralization of technology and distribution of power, or vice versa, depending on what terminology you want to use, it will have to be addressed through this issue of scarcity of capital. And so perhaps DAOs offer a way out. I leave a question mark there because obviously that's ongoing and an open question. And so where does this leave us? Well, I would argue that the governance affordances of blockchain protocols, they combine those of algorithms and open source, but they're much more recombinant and generative. And so they vary in emphasis at different levels, but they become recombinant and most interesting at the deepest level. And this is a fundamental contradiction with what we would imagine to be true of governance in general. And that recombination leads to something I call institutional generativity. It retains the traditional hierarchy of control, but it both retains and inverts the hierarchy of change. And then finally, I would note there's a blockchain-specific paradox of decentralization, with DAOs as a potential way out. And so with that, I will conclude and thank the hosts again for the opportunity to present this work. And I really look forward to questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. There's a lot to unpack here. So we've got lots of time for questions and interactions. So what I'd like to do now is just invite our participants, and we've got a great group here today, to post their questions in the chat for you. And then you can select the questions that you feel comfortable responding to. Okay. And we can invite people also to open their mics. I think just for making sure that we are able to, we're not over talking each other, just raise your hand if you would like to open your mic and pose your question that way. Rather than to the chat. So let's give people a couple minutes to kind of formulate their own questions. And so I will kick off the questions just to give people some space while they're thinking about their own questions. And I'll ask you, in your presentation, which I found a fascinating and generative discourse with Ostrom's work as a kind of a starting point, as you say, but it wasn't exactly clear to me when we're talking about governance and we're talking about governance in the blockchain space, what elements of governance happen through the protocol on chain, and what aspects of governance happen in other spaces that are affiliated with these protocols. And I'm thinking, like blockchain improvement protocol, the blockchain wiki, Reddit, even Twitter, other GitHub spaces. So I'm wondering if you look specifically about where the work of governance is actually taking place in the context of a blockchain, and if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of on-chain versus other spaces, I did elide something important, which is on-chain, on-chain governance in blockchains. It's always difficult to know what to do with that in that there are so few of them. And so we pay a lot of attention to blockchains like Tezos, where amendments actually happen on-chain, but they're relatively rare, so I bracket them here. In terms of where these things happen, yeah, I speak to it a lot more in the paper, and I perhaps should have been clear here, so I'm glad you asked. In terms of the participation architecture that has been elaborated, it really, it begins with these improvement proposals that are proposed, but then they're debated, they're discussed, they're, and then the question is, where are they voted on and where, and that is a very messy process where some of it, that is very fluid. One of the things I write about in level 3 in terms of Ethereum is not just the change to proof of stake, but the fact that after their trials and tribulations in 2016 and 2017 with the DAO hack and with the parity wallet hack, the Ethereum community started evolving new fora for specifically debate and discussion around these kinds of proposals. And so there were online forums built. There's the Ethereum magicians, I think, and there's another group called the Ethereum cat herders. And so there are these groups that were formed specifically to help navigate the lack of clarity around these sorts of changes. So yes, it happens in fora, it happens online, although there is also, it's important to draw a distinction between deliberation and actual decision-making. So a lot of the deliberation happens across these fora, but the decision-making happens in much smaller groups that are established by that participation architecture. And so that is a fundamental tension that is potentially being worked out with DAOs, because then you can assign votes to people in a way that it's difficult to do within the traditional participation architectures. But that's certainly something I need to clarify.
Great. Well, thanks. And there's lots of questions coming in. So we've got hands up in the on the forum, and we've also got lots of questions coming through chat. So I'll leave it to you as to which order you want to take questions.
Okay, guys. Well, I will start with, I'll go back and forth starting with the chat, and then we'll just go through the chat. So Mike, how do off-chain actors affect the institutional generativity of blockchain? That is a great question. So one of my favorite examples of this is thinking about how I initially came to this idea of institutional generativity from thinking about the parallel developments in money. So thinking about stable coins and central bank digital currencies, and the fact that in some way they're both after the same things, using the same technology, the same base technology, a lot of the same base protocol components, but they're moving in completely different directions. Or not completely different directions. They're moving toward their own ends that are somewhat in parallel, because if you define stable as linked to an existing currency, then that becomes an obvious parallel. It's also interesting that a lot of the impetus toward open source, I don't think this is so true of the Federal Reserve, but certainly true of investment banks and large consultancies like Ernst & Young. There's a real impetus toward contributing to the overall field of protocol primitives. And so you have groups like Ernst & Young creating this incredible privacy-oriented protocol. I think it's called Nightfall. And so it's much more, I started out this research thinking I was going to write about incumbents and challengers in this really traditional way. But because it's a general purpose technology, those things are not so neatly separable. That's a great, did I answer your question? Great. Okay. Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Great talk. Really thought-provoking. Lots of stuff that's been on my mind for a long time. I was actually one of the so-called victims of the DAO hack. Oh, wow. And so I got my funds returned as a result of Vitalik's actions. And but philosophically, I was actually against it. I was one of the people that held the argument that we should respect the code, and that was the whole point of decentralization and blockchain technology to begin with. And that kind of led me down the path of the Ethereum Classic community, which eventually led me into the Cardano community, the Cardano blockchain, which you're probably familiar with. And that's a fairly successful proof of stake or a blockchain now. And so it's, anyway, it has a lot of interesting components. And they are doing some interesting things with governance there. As for example, there's a central funding treasury called Project Catalyst. So the Genesis block reserved a bunch of Cardano. ADA is the name of the cryptocurrency. And the community is voting via their stake in their wallets on the different projects that will get funding. So I've got one project right now that's got funded through that mechanism, and I've got proposals in for the next round as well. But that we're running into some interesting issues there. Like you said, there's not a lot of practice. Like it's trying to move to a DAO. But there's all these practical issues. There's just human conflict. And people think one thing should be done one way, somebody else thinks something should be done the other way. And we're running into into problems of scale, like the fact that there's so many projects to review for people to assess the assessors. And so it's reaching a point where now it's talking about delegation. So essentially voting, like creating, representatives that do things on behalf of other people, right? Because I think this is where I am getting, sorry, this is one of those stupid comments that's not really a question, but I'm getting to a question. So I think that I'm curious on your views about that, because I think one of the issues with moving to something, I'm very much still a true believer in moving towards decentralized governance. And I see DAOs as some kind of DAO. When you say DAO, just like you say blockchain, it can mean a whole number of different things. But I see that as being some kind of structure that holds a lot of promise. But first and foremost, I think we run into issues of scale there. So I'm curious on your views about representation, like we have like in a democratic kind of governance structure where somebody's like acts on behalf of other people. Because the problem with anything that gets proposed to a DAO is just your time and attention as an individual participant. You don't have time to and you don't know whether something comes up for proposal or not, and you could miss a lot of things. So that's one question, and I'll be quiet. But my second question is, do you believe it's possible? So the projects that I'm working on, and most projects are really passionate about decentralization, is like, here's our project plan, here's our roadmap, and then we go DAO. And that then we go DAO is kind of like this undefined space where nobody really knows what to do yet, right? And I've been in the blockchain for a while now, and I've seen a lot of projects fail, or they start out saying we're going to do progressive decentralization, and they never do. All the founders get rich first, and then they do either a rug pull or the project fizzles out. And so I'm wondering your views on whether it's, so A, on representation, and B, whether it's possible to go straight to 100% decentralized DAO. Have you seen anything like that? Do you think it's possible? If so, what would be required? Thanks.
Oh, okay, great. Those are both great questions and great comments too. In terms of delegation and the ability to scale that way, it's a fascinating question, and you do see a lot of projects that end up recapitulating sort of what we know about representative government, right? And the benefits of delegation, whether it's in delegated proof of stake and just the basic consensus mechanism, or delegation in terms of expertise. Because again, it's expertise, you can see here, becomes, there might be will, but in addition to time and attention being scarce resources, not every member of a DAO is going to be able to vote in an informed way on every single thing, depending on the nature of the DAO. And I think this gets to your second question, which is, how realistic is it to go straight to a DAO? And I think that really, I'll give you a very consulting firm answer, which is it depends. But what it depends on is, there are a lot of DAOs that are being created now that are specific to deciding what NFT to buy, or deciding, they're very sort of affinity-based DAOs, which is different than what you're talking about, which is governing a protocol, right? And being much more closely involved in the technology. And so I think that how realistic it is really depends on how complex the nature of what is going to be voted on is, right? And so to the extent that there's a match between the interests and experience and expertise of the people in the DAO and the kinds of questions they're going to be asked to vote on, then it does seem pretty realistic to think that it's going to happen pretty quickly. But that does seem to happen vastly more often and almost universally in cases where it's not really technical decisions that are being made, right? It's not really the kinds of changes that I talked about where a giant project incorporates a DAO. It might be more these sort of purpose-built DAOs. And it's very, these kinds of things are very, I'll be honest, a little frustrating to study at the moment, right? Because NFTs and DAOs are sort of jointly becoming so frothy that seeing through to what's actually happening is a little challenging.
Well, the Constitution DAO may be one you might be referring to, right?
Exactly.
Right? A really sad example. No, and it's really sad for us so-called true believers. I think this, the baby's getting thrown out with the bathwater with all it's giving a bad reputation to NFT technology, to all these other to DAO potential. So that's a whole separate discussion about public perception. But
okay, great. Well, thank you for that. Was a great question. Let's go to Chang. Okay, could you please elaborate on why DAO might be a way out, given that DAO embodies the paradox of governance as well? Yeah, no, that's a great, I think this gets at what we were just talking about in terms of the ability to really fine tune and align the DAO with somehow finding a match between the nature of decisions to be taken and the people available on offers. So to the extent, and I'm not sure how to do this and I don't really have an answer, but to the extent that a DAO, I've seen quite a few of them that are actually very honestly wrestling with this question of how to broaden who gets to vote and how they get to vote effectively, given some of the scarcity issues that we were just talking about. And so, yeah, I would see that as a follow-on study to this for sure, because that is so fluid that it's very difficult to say. That's a great question. Okay, Quinn.
Hi, Jason.
Hi.
Thanks for the wonderful talk and nice to meet you. I'll try to be quick here because I think this is a conversation that could go on and on, and probably really ought to. And I actually have a note about that in just in a second. But so I have a question, and then maybe just a couple of on the offshoot that you're not familiar with, a couple of references and a couple of people I'd be happy to connect you with. So my question is it's a big amorphous one, and it might make no sense at all, but I'm hoping I can articulate it in a way that does make sense, which is, so I've just been recently rereading, hold on here, Deleuze and Guattari's Nomadology, the War Machine. Mm-hmm. And specifically, they do this kind of interesting inversion in it. And they say, there are these technologies or these methods that actually help to prevent or inhibit the formation of a state. Right? So that's kind of backwards to how we normally think of it. And specifically what I'm interested in is the space of governance outside of nation states, right? And so I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on what those mechanisms might be. I mean, obviously this is part of the, the utopian dream of cyber libertarian dream that's embedded within Bitcoin and so on and so forth. But I'm just wondering if that re-articulation helps any, or if you have thoughts on it. The other little thing I'll say, just for as far as the question goes, is have you thought much about, you kind of addressed some of the governance world outside of the formal structures, but I think there's a lot of really, especially when it comes to the questions around DAOs, there's a lot of good emerging ethnographic work that starts to look not at what we might make a parallel argument around high finance, looking at like high finance versus low finance versus, the kind of like, earmarking monies and the kind of really basic stuff that people do. There might be a kind of interesting parallel there it might help enrich your account here. I mean, I know you addressed and you said, okay, there's deliberative and then there's, actually where the decision making gets going. But that might be something to think about.
Yeah, I would love to follow up with you about that. And first of all, thank you for your work on the DAO hack, because that was enormously helpful to me and I know to a lot of other people. And I would recommend
no problem.
Anybody who's interested in this, read that. So space of things outside of states, that is a fascinating question. And it's something I've gone back and forth about, right? So I talk about institutions a lot. And the reason I settled on institutions was that as we know, a lot of this started from attempts, A, to work outside of the state, but B, by creating specifically state-based or state-inspired alternatives that were digital. So the ability to create smart contracts as a form of law, the ability to create new forms of triple entry accounting, all of these sort of new variants really seem to take the state as their starting point and then look to make something better. So the relationship to the state and working outside of the state becomes a little complicated because of that, I think. And so, I mean, for example, if you look at a lot of the arguments is, that people go on and on, is Bitcoin money? And is the arguments about whether we can establish something as money are grounded in definitions that are set around state money. So the ability to disentangle them, I think, is complicated by that. But I do take your point that, there are attempts to build things outside of the state, obviously, and they're worth paying attention to. But I think the traditional and the new institutions are imbricated a lot more than would seem to be the case if approaching them as something that operates strictly outside of state.
I think it's fair, just sort of jump in. I think it's a fair response or whatever. I suppose maybe it was less the issue about being outside of space, but rather the inhibitory qualities. I think that's kind of the inhibitory, like the way, like those technologies or methods that inhibit the formation, right? Because I think especially also we have this, when we conceptualize the state, we have this idea of it just as natural progression, right? Like it emerges out of like clans or something like this. And that's, something we can sort of problematize. And I wonder if there's governance moves basically that do this, right? Like maybe there's I don't want to speculate too much, but like maybe we could consider Ostrom as an anti-state mechanism or something. These are modalities of organization that
I see what you mean.
Somebody might think, or maybe it's possible that they actually, as it were, naturally prohibit the evolution towards a nation state and the violence that's necessarily part of the nation state and so on and so forth, right? I mean, that's a bunch of speculative kind of stuff, but I think it's an idea that popped in my head recently, and it seems like it's one that sort of might underpin some of your own work.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's a lot to think about there, and you make a really good point about the specificity of Ostrom, right? Like she's really positioned herself as between, arguing that you don't need pure private property and you don't need the state. There is a third way. At least that was her earlier work. Her later work, that kind of disappears in the background because, as I said, she was really trying to generalize across different settings. But that's a really fascinating point that I need to look into further. For sure.
I don't want to monopolize any more time, but I will say if you or other people aren't familiar with this issue around, we've already basically danced around this idea of exiting to a DAO. Nathan Schneider is an author who is a close colleague, and he has his work on exit to community. I think that's helpful. And as well as finally, I'll also just put out to people that there's a lot of my European colleagues do a bunch of work in this space as well, looking at Primavera de Filippi's work. Her Koala group, COALA.
I was a member of that for a while.
Is okay, wonderful. Then, so you're already familiar. And I was also going to put out Morshed Menan's co-op. He's got a paper on co-ops and stuff that I think is it's a must read. It's one of the most intelligent analyses of governance and communities that I've read in recent time. So just as a prop,
that's great. Thank you.
Good citations there. Thanks a lot, though.
Good. Yeah. No. Thank you. That was helpful. Okay. So, Peter, what are the Ostrom variables? So the Ostrom variables, there's Ostrom variables and Ostrom levels. So the variables were the rules in use, the roles and rights, et cetera. And then the levels were what you describe here: operational, constitutional, collective choice. So there are vertical levels and then horizontal variables that play across them. Answer. Okay, great. And then Tim, can you discuss the link between hard forks and governance mechanisms? For example, after the famous DAO hack, there was significant conflict in the Ethereum community. What was the aftermath of the fork? Yeah, that's a great question. So there were two things, and this thinking about that case actually was what led me to start thinking about generativity, because you have two things that were going on, right? Like depending on your perspective, you could say it was a terrible outcome because Ethereum Classic forked off and you had a real split in the community and a split in the economic value of the ledger and so on. But at the same time, there was a split, but the Ethereum community, as a result of that hack and as a result of also the Parity Wallet hack, started developing all these new mechanisms, and it became an occasion or a prompt for the articulation of new forms of coordination. And so it was really both. And so it's this sort of Janus face thing where if you think about forks as just disruptive to something that exists, then the more generative side wouldn't be necessarily visible. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Irene, hello, Irene. Do you think that blockchain or DLT could be useful for long-term preservation of information? That would really depend. I mean, the challenge with blockchains is they have to keep going, right? There's not some database that's necessarily going to be stored somewhere. So for the lifetime of the blockchain, that would be a great way to preserve information. But if the blockchain ends, if there's a dissolution in the community, if people stop running servers and so on, then it's no longer viable as a way of storing information. Oh, okay.
Can I add a little bit to that? I'm an
please.
archivist like Victoria. I'm an open source software developer. I've developed 2 open source software packages called Archivematica and Access to Memory. And they're the most widely deployed open source platforms for preserving digital information. And so the short answer is no. Like, just putting something in a blockchain does not guarantee long-term preservation at all. You need active archival practices and archival organizations or actors to take responsibility for that. And the current designs of the blockchains, the blockchains are the amount of data you can get into a blockchain transaction is very minimal. So even with NFTs, for example, or even when people say, I'm going to notarize my document on the blockchain, what they're actually doing is notarizing a hash of the document. And NFTs themselves, the actual JPEGs and so forth, are not kept on chain. They're kept off chain, typically now on a platform called like IPFS or Arweave. And so what's currently lacking is actual applying the same archival principles, standards, tools, technologies that we're using in the Web 2 world to the Web 3 world to actually make sure that there's long-term preservation applied to mission critical, society critical, personal critical information that you're so-called putting on the blockchain. And there's a whole off-chain architecture that needs to be developed for that. And to do it in a proper Web3 decentralized way, which is pretty decentralized, is really challenging. But that's that's basically my area of expertise and interest. And the projects I'm working on are doing that.
Oh, great, thank you. That was very helpful. All right, so Vicky, I think that the top part of your question got cut off. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand he was asking the last part. Do you think that blockchains provide sufficiently for social disagreement in technical architecture?
Yeah, so let me give you some context there. So you spoke about consensus as being something that we achieve through the blockchain protocols, and of course then referenced Unger's work and talking about the generativity of discourse and disagreement in the open source space, and then of course blockchain forking and so on. But the blockchain forking can often kind of destroy communities. Like, you get complete breakdowns in governance, and where whole sections of the community break off, exit, and create new communities. So I'm wondering if, because of that, you think that blockchain governance, if we were to look at that as sort of a replacement for sort of state governance, is that really sustainable for us? Because it seems like it's a very fragile form of governance that doesn't bring people into community necessarily with each other, but actually the only way out, or the only way to solve a disagreement, is to get out. So I wonder, what your thoughts are on how fragile a type of governance that might be, or if you agree with that point.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that point. And it is quite fragile. And I think I would respond also that it's, in thinking about level 2 in terms of these decisions about the protocol itself, that I specified as a community decision that often resides outside the protocol, again, because on-chain governance is generally a quite rare thing. So if we think about off-chain governance, where people have to deliberate and they have to decide to changes, it is quite fragile at times. It's fragile to disagreement, I would say. It's quite robust to when people are moving in a similar direction, but and the sources of fragility might be, one, that the participation architecture as it exists, as it names who's able to participate and in what ways in the improvement protocols and so on, that can sometimes be incomplete in terms of not including every interested party. And the other case is the community is just incapable of reaching agreement. And there really isn't a mechanism for reconciling that. So yeah, a lot of this does seem quite fragile and frankly, amazing that it works at all at times. So yeah, I don't mean to, I in no way mean to imply that it's something that works in every case or, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more that I'd love to delve into with you on that point, but I don't want, I don't want to cut off. There's so many great questions and discussions. So I guess the last, just kind of flagging it to say, can we look for examples of blockchains that are maybe trying to build, mechanisms for greater flexibility to incorporate diverse views, more flexibility, having subcultures within there. I'm not seeing that take shape in the blockchain governance space, but I think it's something that we really need to tend to.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I think this gets back to why DAOs are so interesting, because a lot of this is happening in DAOs that may or may not be governing actual blockchains, but there is a lot of experimentation here. But it's within the past 9 months, right? So it's very, very recent. But that is a great question. And I would love to circle back and talk more about that. Connor, so with blockchain systems headed toward representational systems of governance, at what point do they become the centralized bodies / institutions that they're seeking to replace? Yeah. I'm not sure I would say, do they become? I would maybe another way to state that would be, at what point do they start to just recapitulate the structures they're replacing, right? So we are vastly more likely to see blockchain governance become a representation of representative government than we are to see a blockchain become a mode of representative government of the state. So I think it's more a question of recapitulating things that exist and reproducing them than it is of necessarily replacing. Oh, thank you, Quinn. Okay. Fantastic. Is there, Mark David, is there a relevant level 4 that goes across protocols and chains to aggregate into larger cross-project institutions? Yes, there absolutely is. And I left it out because, I mean, I would think of that as consortiums, right? In the sense that you've got different, I mean, there's a couple different ways. So in industry, there are consortia, right, that operate in this way, that are working across different potential applications. And within blockchain, you also have this really, and it's something I want to study more in future work, these really fascinating cross-pollination of foundations that that fund complementary developments. But then you've got these complementary developments when they get funding, feeding funding back into the foundation or funding other complementary developments. And so you've got this really interesting cross-pollination of resources and attention and time that is much more focused on the ecosystem than on the individual ledger itself. So yeah, I do leave that out. I had it in an earlier version, but it just got to be too unwieldy, but it is a great point and certainly something that merits studying. Okay. Is there a mechanism for merging blockchains? Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I mean, there's merge mining, which is a different thing, which is when you sort of take advantage of the resources of two different chains. But as far as merging a blockchain, I'm not really sure. Can you elaborate on the bidirectional change? Yeah, so the idea there is that you've got change that works from the top down in terms of governance that happens. If something doesn't work at one level, it triggers a change at the next level down. And I'm assuming this question is about what I argued about, the fact that change can begin at the bottom, at the most entrenched level, because of this ability to recombine and create new institutions that then reshapes the protocol and reshapes the governance of the protocol that then reshapes the normal operating of the protocol. And so that's not something we would necessarily expect if we're thinking about governance in these layers.
There's some interesting stuff happening with cross-chain. When you say did one chain bring into the other, but there is like things like Polkadot and other bridges that are in the works, but I'm somewhat skeptical about them vis-a-vis the security and the tokenomics working out properly. And that's, again, it's a moving experiment.
Yeah. Yeah, and Chang made a similar point. But so this idea of interoperability is really important. That it's a lot of this analysis is also, quite frankly, there are so many things happening at so many levels that it's almost a lot of the most interesting innovation is happening at this sort of level 2, where you've got these chains and they sort of evolve, but then you've got these layers that get layered on top of them that extend the functionality and that allow you to do things like be interoperable and maybe create custom chains and do all sorts of things. And there's this real proliferation of potential solutions. Oh, great. Yeah, Peter and Quinn, thank you so much for these papers.
So
are you familiar with?
Just taking note of the time. So if there's last comments that you'd like to make, Jason. This has been, obviously we need to continue this conversation. There's so much that people want to share and so much to be said about this space. So I think we better connect to think about how we can make that happen again. But I'll just turn it over to you for some closing thoughts for us. And
So first of all, I want to close with gratitude. These comments have been incredibly helpful and generative for me, certainly. There's a lot to think about here, and I look forward to that, to working through these. This is exactly what I was looking for in terms of feedback here, so thank you very much. And also thank you to those who shared their readings. They're fantastic, and I look forward to digging into them. And finally, I want to say thank you again to Blockchain at UBC for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. We really appreciate it. It's been fascinating, and it's opened up some fascinating lines of discussion. So thank you to you. Thank you to all of our participants for your great recommendations for papers, your great thoughts. This is really what we want to have going on in the Blockchain at UBC community, co-generation of knowledge and community sharing. That's what it's all about. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and we will see you next time. So take care.
All right, great. Thank you.
Bye.